Thanks for joining us, Barry. We're here just to review a transaction that we recently completed with you, and it'd be useful to get perhaps give the viewers a bit of an insight as to the background to the transaction and what prompted you to sell and what you were expecting.
Sure, yeah. So I was Chief Executive Officer of Double First Limited and Dupre Limited. And Double First is an education software provider to schools, and it makes management information software. So effectively, that sort of mission critical software that sits within a school to help it run the whole school, really, from the kind of admissions process right through to alumni and all of the things that sit inside. That's a very successful business in the UK independent and international schools marketplace. And the other business that was a transaction for Polestar was Dupre Limited, which is a very successful, long-standing telecommunications and IT business. It was actually a business that had really, I think, grown right from the sort of start of the telecoms era and gone into all of the convergence of telecoms and IT. But really interesting and successful business. Like at the start that we had was that we had a majority shareholder that was involved with 3 separate businesses that I was running on his behalf. And ultimately, that shareholder wanted to exit the businesses and retire. So the role I had ultimately when I came in as CEO of the businesses was to get that exit for the owner. And the first transaction was our education software business, and that was quite a difficult transaction in the sense that it wasn't as though there was lots of precedent in the marketplace for businesses in that particular industry. And therefore there wasn't an easy way to value the business. There wasn't an easy way to necessarily market the business. But we worked with Polestar to obviously create first of all a teaser and then an information memorandum and get all the detail in the business, which was a really good process because it actually helped us think about the questions that we might get asked, the information that we would need to produce during the process of due diligence, and kind of ask ourselves those difficult questions before we actually took the business to market. So Double First was the first business, and that was a process where we were looking at a number of different potential outcomes, and we considered an MBO, we considered a trade sale, and we'd also considered some sort of private equity sale as well. And I don't think any of us really knew what that might look like, so it was quite a long process, really. We went to a number of PE providers, and really the business wasn't quite big enough for it to be interesting for PE. At that time, we probably could have waited a year or two, but it wasn't really the right time for the business or those types of buyers. So in the end, we decided that it would be probably a trade sale, and we therefore drew up a shortlist together. So lots of research went in from the Polestar people, and effectively then we took that business to market. And I think what you don't realise when you're going to do that, you sort of in your head think, well, somebody will make an offer, and then you'll proceed, and that will be that. And of course, the reality is hugely different to that. It's a lot more complex than that, and we had a number of issues that went on during that process, and I think that even when we found the right buyer and we proceeded ultimately to a sale, there was a long process of what I would call mini negotiations. So you sort of have your headline, you have your enterprise value, But then there's a number of mini negotiations that are constantly going throughout the actual process. And you need to be ensuring, of course, that whilst you're doing that, that the business is performing, because you've made some commitments in an IM as to the future of the business. And of course, as time carries on and the longer that goes on, those commitments that you made actually have to come true, or the business doesn't look quite as appealing as it was. And perhaps the offer that was made or the sentiment around the sale might change. So I think the real complication is trying to keep all of the plates spinning. And in that time, the nice thing about having advisors around you is you can ask them to carry on with quite a lot of the work that is around negotiation and making sure that everything continues in a good way, and that there aren't any problems, and really just have somebody on your side, I suppose, throughout that process. And that's the bit that I found really useful, and the bit where I felt really well supported, particularly when I was out of my depth and hadn't had any experience in a particular part of a negotiation or process that was going on. And I think without that, it would have been. I can see many occasions where we could have faltered and ultimately failed in our ambition of exiting that business. And to a certain extent, that's true, with the other businesses, the other two businesses that were sold as well. The very small business in that we actually kind of dealt with ourselves, but really off the back of quite a lot of advice that we'd already received and experience we've won through working with Polestar and working, through the other transactions. But the second transaction was also, quite a complex one. Two, had a number of issues, not least COVID, just as we were really about to close that transaction. And Richard's advice over that process and his experience in that sector really was essential in the sense of being able to get that done as well. I think in terms of setting our expectations as to what was realistic, and in terms of them being able to progress things, and again just keep everything moving along as we went through the process. That's the bit that's so important. I think that whilst you're trying to run the business and keep the business working really well and doing everything that you said it was going to do, having that advice and support around you to just prop you up and give you that support during what is inevitably going to be a stressful and difficult period where you're just trying to juggle so much. So
worth maybe touching on managing perhaps different relationships between sort of shareholders, buyers, advisors, different advisors as you go through, and where that was sort of key, and where that was perhaps more complex, etc.
In the particular situation that I was in, I was a shareholder myself, but a minority shareholder, and obviously the majority shareholder was the person I was chiefly representing. But obviously I also had all of the other minority shareholders' interests as well to consider. And I think when you think about the amount of people involved in a transaction, you've got your advisors, you've got your shareholders, you've got advisors on the other side, those investors or shareholders as well. You've got all of the professional parties that are involved in the transaction as well. And there's a lot of communication, that has to go on over that process. And as you do go through the sort of mini negotiations for a process as well, it can be really helpful to, I think, have some people that aren't quite so emotionally attached to what's going on in terms of either an outcome or something that somebody may feel particularly passionate about as an outcome or as an issue that's going on during the transaction. So I think where advisors come into this is being able to give you that advice and put your arm around you or be on your side, and just give you that sort of independent advice that is in your interests, that isn't perhaps biased or particularly around somebody's own personal interests. So they can give you, I suppose, some realism in the sense of what's going on and what the art of the possible actually is. But you can also use the advisor to have a conversation that perhaps you don't want to have directly, whether that's to find something out, to understand the sentiment, to see how something's gone down, you know, just really using, I think, the advisor to great effect as that sort of unbiased and independent thinker in the process is really important. And I think, you know, if you're choosing an advisor, it has to be somebody ultimately that, you know, you believe is going to be on your side. Clearly, you know, everybody's got some level of interest, you know, in an outcome, including the advisor. And, you know, I won't go into the, you know, the mechanics and how I feel, you know, you should be engaging with an advisor, but I think it does help if you've set out a structure of how you work with your advisors, where, you know, ultimately the work that they're putting in is going to get rewarded, you know, in some way, whatever the outcome is. I think that reduces the risk of people being biased towards wanting to get to a particular outcome regardless, because they've put so much work in, or, you know, have you know, spent lots of time doing something. I think you know, getting the right structure is important.
So I think the other area that's probably worth touching on is as you get into the deal, one of the big areas is what the involvement is from management, and you know, there's clearly a lot of involvement from management at different stages, even with the support of advisors sort of guiding you in the right direction. But you know, in terms of sort of data preparation and perhaps what you had in place, what you might have done differently with the benefit of hindsight around the data sort of collation, but also perhaps how that process helped when you got to the due diligence stage.
Yeah, sure. So you know, I think it is really important to spend the time preparing the business, you know, for sale, and preparing yourself for the process of due diligence. And I think all you can really do to do that is obviously try and anticipate the types of things that are going to come up during that, and clearly having advisors that have some experience in the sector and the process are really helpful to be able to help prepare you. I think whatever you think you're going to get asked, though, you tend to get asked, you know, that, but in more detail, in a way you might not have thought you're going to be asked. You're going to have to prepare information in different formats. So I think having the information stored and available, and, you know, able to be as flexibly presented, or different, you know, things calculated as a result of the data you've got, is really important. So I think, you know, if you know you've got poor data, or you know you in a particular area, and you think, well, we can probably get away with that, and this won't be a big part of the diligence process, you're probably wrong, in the sense that you know, the light tends to get shone in the area that probably you're most worried about, probably most of all, because I think as soon as a weakness is detected by you know, the person you're negotiating with, whether that's really important to them or not, they'll probably try and exploit that weakness, whether that's as a way to negotiate or to get a win, or whatever the case may be. So I think, you know, it is important to spend the time preparing yourself. And I think, you know, from our perspective, we probably didn't do enough of that. The area we didn't prepare ourselves in well enough was probably in the financial area. We had a good team to run our business, and we didn't necessarily have enough people. I think you know, the people we had were fine, and if all they were doing was a due diligence process, I think we would have been absolutely fine. But to run a business and run a due diligence process that's a very tough thing to do. So I think being prepared either for a very difficult time and sort of thinking, well, for the next 12 months, I'm not going to get much of a holiday or whatever the case may be, just being prepared to put the overtime and the effort in, and just knowing that you're going through that difficult period and sort of mentally preparing yourself for that, or making sure, and I think this is the better way, making sure you've got the enough people and enough information able to be presented in as many different ways as you need to. Having that resource around you is really important, and I think you should certainly be prepared for that, whichever way you decide to do it. And I think there's a certain amount advisors can help you with there, but ultimately it's your business and you know it, and you're not going to be able to pull the wool over anybody's eyes in all likelihood in the process. Not only would you not want to, because it's not honest or ethical, and there's obviously risk the more you do that anyway, but you just it's just probably going to get found out. So you're better off just being upfront and honest and making sure that anything you provide shows the true picture of your business, so that you're properly declaring what the business is and how it functions and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's better to spend a few months preparing than it is to go in too early to a process when you're not fully prepared.
Yeah, I think that flexibility of presentation is an interesting point, because I think people do have their presentation as suits them for their business internally, and then another business comes in and looks at it in a slightly different perspective that you maybe hadn't considered. So being able to flex the data around certainly helps, and I think getting that data together up front in the preparation stage, so that when we get to the sort of due diligence stage with the client, that they're already up the curve in terms of that presentation is really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I don't think that I don't think that the sort of M&A corporate development work is, I don't think it's a black art. I think it's a science ultimately, and what you're sort of buying for advice is the experience of that science and how things typically work, and being able to prepare yourself and have that flexibility of data is just so important, because however you think about your business, somebody else is coming in, they're either going to, naturally people will always look at something and have questions that you won't have thought about, but they also may have their own aspirations for how the business is going to work in the future, and you may not know what those things are. So some of the questions may seem a bit frustrating or even irrelevant, but they're important to the buyer. So if they're important to the buyer, and this is somebody that you think can pay you what you want for your business, then they're important enough that you've got to be able to give a satisfactory answer. So I just think it's really important to be prepared.